right, let's dive into the history of Washington State. It's a story that's way more complex and frankly more packed with conflict and transformation than you might think.
So here's the big question we're tackling today. How on earth did this land, home to ancient cultures and fought over by global empires, turn into the tech and trade giant it is today? We're going to connect the dots by looking at the constant struggle for control that has really defined this region, from its earliest days right up to the present. Let's get into it. Okay, so first things first. To really get Washington's story, we've got to rewind, and I mean way, way back. Long before any European ships ever appeared on the horizon.
Yeah, you heard that right. 13,000 years. To put that into perspective, we're talking about a human history here that predates the pyramids, predates Stonehenge. It predates pretty much everything we think of as ancient history. It's just a staggering amount of time that sets the stage for everything to come. And what's really cool here is how the land itself shaped the people. It's like you had two completely different worlds existing side by side. Over on the coast, you had tribes like the Makah and Chinook. They had this incredible abundance from the Pacific. We're talking salmon, whales, and cedar trees for everything. This wealth created really complex societies. But head inland onto the plateau, and it was a totally different ballgame. Tribes like the Yakima and Spokane lived by the rhythm of the seasons, hunting, fishing, gathering, which led to a society where work was much more evenly split between men and women. And then, suddenly, everybody wanted a piece of the action. In less than 30 years, it was this mad dash for control. You've got Spain showing up first. Then in the exact same year, 1792, Britain's Captain Vancouver is claiming Puget Sound, while an American captain, Robert Gray, finds the mouth of the massive Columbia River, giving the U.S. a huge claim. A few years later, Lewis and Clark come marching over the mountains. The board was set, and the players were ready for a serious clash. And a clash is exactly what they got. This next phase of Washington's story, well, it's defined by conflict. We're talking about empires drawing lines on a map, for sure, but also about real, violent fights on the ground that would shape what this place was all about. You know, at first, Washington wasn't even its own thing. It was just the northern chunk of this huge Oregon territory. But the settlers up north felt ignored, so they lobbied hard, and in 1853, they got their wish. Washington Territory was born. And the man sent to govern it? Oh boy. His name was Isaac Stevens, and he was about to stir up a whole lot of trouble. And I mean, just listen to this. This one quote pretty much sums up his entire approach to governing. He was a my way or the highway kind of guy, and he was not afraid to use some serious muscle to get what he wanted. And this attitude, well, it nearly tore the brand new territory apart before it even got started. This is where it gets wild. You just can't make this stuff up. Stevens goes full authoritarian, declares martial law, and starts arresting settlers he thinks are disloyal. But the courts aren't having it. So what does he do? He arrests one of the judges. Can you believe that? This leads to an actual armed standoff. You have the local sheriff and his posse on one side, defending the courthouse, and the governor's own militia on the other. It was a showdown right out of a Western, and Stevens was ultimately forced to back down. Just an incredible moment of checks and balances at work on the frontier. And while all this internal drama was happening, Stevens was also leading a really brutal war against the Native American tribes. He was pushing these coercive treaties that were basically land grabs, and leaders like Chief Leshy of the Nisqually rightfully resisted. The conflict that followed was tragic and devastating, and it ended with the tribes being defeated and their people forced onto reservations. So, once the territory's borders were more or less settled, the main fight shifted. It wasn't about nations or tribes anymore. Now it was a classic story, the people versus the powerful. And in the Gilded Age, powerful meant one thing above all else, the railroads. Now, Washington's populist movement is super interesting because it did a complete 180. The first version, the early People's Party, was actually pretty conservative. They were focused on fighting corruption and political bosses. But then, by the 1880s, it had totally flipped. It became this progressive, pro-labor, pro-women's suffrage movement aimed squarely at breaking up corporate monopolies. But, and this is a really important but, this movement had a deeply ugly side. All that economic anxiety and anger got twisted and aimed at Chinese immigrants. The violence was just horrific. In the Tacoma riot of 1885, a mob literally forced every single Chinese resident out of the city and then burned their community to the ground. It got so bad the governor had to declare martial law to restore order. It's a truly dark chapter in the state's history. So right in the middle of all this turmoil, Washington finally makes it. On November 11th, 1889, it becomes the 42nd state. But joining the Union didn't solve its problems. In fact, the new state constitution made it pretty clear where the next battle lines were drawn. It specifically shot down women's suffrage and prohibition, guaranteeing those fights would continue for years. And the politics of the time just got weirder. Get this, in 1896, you had this wild team-up of populists, Democrats, and a bunch of Republicans who were angry about the gold standard. They all joined forces and somehow managed to win the election. They elected a guy named John R. Rogers from the People's Party as governor. To this day, he's the only third-party governor Washington has ever had. Just goes to show how fed up people were with the status quo. All right, let's jump in to the 20th century. Because this is when Washington's story gets completely rewritten, forged in the heat of global war and some major social upheavals. World War II changed everything. It basically took the state's economy and put it on steroids. Boeing went from a small plane maker to an absolute behemoth, churning out thousands of heavy bombers. The shipyards in Puget Sound were critical. And then you have the top-secret Hanford site in the east, which was making the plutonium for the atomic bomb. The war turned Washington into an industrial juggernaut, setting the stage for everything that came next. But that post-war boom brought old tensions back to the surface. The fight for Native American rights reignited in what became known as the Fish Wars. And at the heart of this was an incredible activist, Billy Frank Jr. of the Nisqually tribe. He led this brilliant campaign of civil disobedience, staging fish-ins to protest the state ignoring treaty rights that guaranteed tribes the right to fish. They were simply demanding that the government honor its own promises. And you know what? They won. Big time. The 1974 Bolt decision was a landmark Supreme Court ruling that completely vindicated them. It affirmed that the treaties are the law of the land and that the tribes were entitled to half the fish harvest. It was a massive victory and a powerful chapter in that long struggle for control and sovereignty. Okay, that brings us into the modern era. And this is where the Washington we all recognize today really takes shape, thanks to a literal volcano, a few tech geniuses in their garages, and some massive global protests. And you can't talk about modern Washington without talking about May 18th, 1980, the day Mount St. Helens blew its top. It wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a psyche-altering event for the entire state, a raw, terrifying demonstration of the awesome power simmering just beneath the surface. And then came a different kind of explosion, an economic one. Those industrial seeds planted during World War II finally blossomed into these global titans. Microsoft, which put a computer on every desk. Amazon, which changed how we shop for, well, everything. Add in established giants like Boeing and new global brands like Starbucks and Costco, and suddenly, this corner of the country is an epicenter of the global economy. So it's only fitting, really, that Washington became the stage for the next great struggle, the 1999 Battle of Seattle, when tens of thousands of protesters descended on the city to shut down the World Trade Organization meeting. It put the state front and center in the new, explosive global debate over free trade, labor rights, and what our interconnected world should look like. So you see the pattern, right? From tribal lands and territorial disputes to corporate power and global trade, the history of Washington has been one relentless series of struggles for control. Which brings us back to our big question, but now aimed at the future. What new struggles for control are going to define this state's identity next? If you found this history of Washington compelling, be sure to explore our U.S. State Histories playlist for more. And don't forget to subscribe to Notebook Summaries for more explainers that connect the dots.